From losing the fastest game in professional history, to being the lowest ranked player to compete in pro play, all the way to the biggest fines Riot has ever given, these are 10 league records that nobody wants to have. Starting with what is arguably the worst team in a major competitive region's history, in Team Coast's legendary 1-17 season during the LCS in 2015. While the worst roster in League's professional history will of course vary depending on who you ask, Team Coast's spring 2015 performance is undoubtedly the worst that the LCS has ever seen, as it still remains a strong contender for the worst League team of all time for a variety of different reasons. Despite a record of 1-17 already being an objectively horrible scoreline that to this day is still one of the worst ever seen throughout League's 15 or so years of professional play, the way Team Coast managed to lose so many of their games can best be described by this legendary Scarra quote that until they lose, they are winning, with their first game of the season really showing how rough things were about to get.
Don't trade this because your Nexus will die. Your Nexus will die. The Baron takes too long to kill. What are they thinking?
That's bad news, Bears. I do not know where that call just came from.
You could interrupt these game's over.
That's not empowered. Transcendent blade through the entire team. That's going to put the nail in the coffin. And after being on their heels for the past 7 minutes, Dignitas is going to take down the Nexus to win their first game of the North American Spring Split.
Now, despite this insane throw and coming off of a lot of visa issues leading up to the season's start, Team Coast did manage to pick up their only win of the split in their following game against Winterfox. But even then, this was largely due to the fact that Winterfox was playing with 3 substitutes, as they ended up being not that bad of a team when they got their actual lineup, while for Team Coast, things would only continue to get worse and worse from there. Though their early game as a team wasn't too bad, it was Team Coast shot calling and positioning when it came to the mid and late game that was abysmal, with players being picked off due to incredibly questionable positioning, as well as being unable to teamfight properly. Not to mention that many of these games were just slow, disorganized matches that Team Coast could never recover from nor hold leads in. And due to their originally planned coach being unable to ever arrive to help salvage these issues due to visa problems of his own, by the middle of the season, they literally just had a random friend of one of the players stand in as a coach on stage just to look nice and to appear professional. Even with constant roster swaps and a short-term deal with a North American Challengers team that would eventually end after just a few weeks, Team Coast eventually got to the point in which they were simply just not practicing, getting clobbered on stage, and eventually being relegated out of the LCS entirely. However, while it would make sense for a lower caliber LCS team to come in with some pretty low expectations, what shocked the entire league scene was the fastest series in the game's competitive history, which didn't take place in a regular season or even in playoffs, but instead during the finals of 2019's MSI. While 3-0 sweeps during international league events aren't too uncommon and are normally the result of an LCK or LPL first seed clobbering a Western opponent early on into the tournament, this was no ordinary MSI, as even before the finals started, expectations were already starting to fly out the window. With the group stage already having the fastest game in League's international history, during the semifinals things got even crazier as both G2 and Team Liquid managed to pull off a shocking pair of upsets over their respective Eastern opponents, setting up what was supposed to be an incredibly hyped matchup between North America and Europe on the game's biggest stage, with these two teams looking to solidify the next chapter in their regional rivalry, this time for an international title. But despite the immense amount of hype this series brought with it, to call this best of 5 finals a stomp would still be an understatement, as G2 made a joke of Team Liquid through a stellar performance by eventual MVP Caps alongside their ADC Perks, as the LCS representatives were steamrolled across a combined total of 74 minutes and 31 seconds of game time for the entire series, with the last game only taking around 18 or so minutes from start to finish. An absolute heartbreaker for Team Liquid and the North American fan base, who still have yet to come this close to lifting their first international trophy even to this very day. Also, as a bit of extra trivia about how unbelievably short this series was, the combined game time of all 3 matches still was more than 20 minutes short of the longest single game in League's professional history, where we now arrive at for the unfortunate record of the most CS farmed by a pro player who still ended up losing. You see, during the LCK's 2018 spring split, as teams headed into the final game of this now infamous best-of-3 series between Jin Air Green Wings and SKT, all eyes were on Jin Air's ADC Teddy to once again carry his team to victory after a pair of excellent performances in the previous 2 matches. But in locking in Sivir, he would need to bide his time to truly come online, and bide his time he did. Despite SKT cracking open one of Jin Air's inhibitors at exactly 39 minutes into the game, due to Sivir's immense wave clear, Teddy managed to hold the line even against his ranged opposition in SKT's Bang, creating a stalemate between the 2 teams with hardly any kills and very little action other than just both ADCs simply farming it up. In fact, this game was so drawn out that things even got to the point where the casters pretty much just took a break from covering the game itself and ended up asking one another about their days. And to be honest, I don't blame them.
So how's your night going?
You know, it's taken some twists and turns I didn't see coming. I thought maybe getting some chicken wings tonight, but that was about 3 hours ago.
Yeah.
That's not happening.
I was expecting to be done by about, 9:45, 10:15, something like that.
I have 6 days in a row starting from Tuesday. That's pretty cool.
How many times does Jin Air play in that time span?
Too many times. Actually, it's more than 0.
However, despite this game already taking an unbelievably long amount of time, it would have to end eventually, and with both ADCs already breaking the previous CS record that was once held by Sven, at least one of their efforts would be record-setting for all the wrong reasons, as unfortunately for Bang, Umpty's catch-out onto Faker would solidify his place in history as the player with the most CS in a loss ever, farming up an absurd 974 CS in a 94-minute long game that ultimately ended in his own Nexus exploding, while Teddy would secure himself an astonishing 1,456 CS of his own to pull off this unexpected upset over the recent Worlds finalists. But hey, at least this unfortunate record would be the result of surprisingly close competition, which is something that cannot be said about the performance of the LCS representatives during the first half of Worlds 2022's group stage. Now, I get that this record might be a little niche, but considering how much of the conversation it dominated for the first half of this tournament, I felt it was worth including due to simply how insane it is, as the LCS region is still the current record holder for the longest amount of games in a row to have not destroyed a single Tier 2 turret. While it's not exactly breaking news to say that the LCS has historically had its struggles against opponents during international competition, during the first half of Worlds 2022's group stage games, after each of the 3 LCS representatives had played every opponent in their respective groups, the region went a shocking 0-9 as a whole, and things didn't stop there. As it was pointed out by this now infamous Reddit post about the region's shortcomings on their home turf, the LCS performance of their losses was so incredibly bad that in 9 games they had yet to take a single Tier 2 turret in any of them, which even in losses is an objective that the losing team can probably secure at least one of before ultimately losing their own Nexus. Also, keep in mind, this wasn't even happening against just the ever-dominant LCK and LPL teams, as this streak involved losses to Fnatic, G2, and the Flying Oysters, all of whom managed to prevent any North American player from toppling a single one of these turrets. However, thankfully for the LCS, at least the break between rounds of the group stage seemed to serve them well, as in their first game back against Fnatic, Cloud9 would finally break this curse in their victory over the European squad in what is perhaps the most hyped Tier 2 turret take that League has ever seen.
Will this be the first Tier 2 tower for NA at Worlds? They're going to start hitting it on and Fnatic have no way to defend it. C9! Die, you stupid turret! Die, die, die!
But though Cloud9 would snap this streak of losses with a victory of their own, they would unfortunately find themselves as the unlucky record holders of two of the most painful fines in League's professional history. And while we'll cover the biggest single financial loss that a team has ever been hit with in just a little bit, let's first talk about the somewhat recent finding of their former mid laner Eminez as the team was getting ready for Worlds in 2023. Despite being a pretty likable personality when it came to his onstage presence, Cloud9's Eminez began to develop a bit of a reputation for his toxicity in high elo solo queue as the year progressed, eventually reaching a breaking point in some pretty rough remarks during a Korean solo queue bootcamp in preparation for League's biggest tournament. After a presumably frustrating match involving the well-known Pantheon main Spearshot, who was also doing a Korean bootcamp of his own, Eminez initiated the conflict by calling his teammate a disgusting EU streamer that needed to go back to his own country, which not only is that just a wild thing to say to another person, but when you think about it for even just a moment, it's a pretty ironic insult as well, considering that Eminez began his career in Genji's Academy lineup and was now playing in the LCS. And even after understandably catching some pretty decent heat for this flaming remark, Eminez's initial response to the situation still wasn't that great, explaining that he felt that many of his one-trick teammates were lowering their level of play for content purposes, mainly lashing out at Spearshot since he was essentially just the straw that broke the camel's back. But even after eventually apologizing for his toxic behavior due to this community-wide backlash, just a couple of weeks later, Riot announced that as a result of his actions, Eminez would be individually fined $15,000, as well as required to complete additional behavior training for his unprovoked remarks, in combination with a high frequency of other reports for similarly toxic behavior across other matches, with the Cloud9 mid laner eventually announcing his retirement from professional play following the team's elimination from Worlds just a little over a month later. And while these types of competitive high elo solo queue games are where you'd expect for pro players to be training for their matches against the game's best, this wasn't the case for the lowest ranked player in League's professional history, a support player from 2012's Moscow 5 lineup named Edward, or Gosu Pepper, who played on this legendary roster from League's early days despite being hard stuck in high silver. After beginning his days in the game's smaller competitive scene by participating in mini tournaments within the Russian community, Edward's much more amateur team would eventually find themselves crushed by the now legendary player Alex Ich, so he befriended him to play solo queue together, despite their large skill difference. Though the two took different paths for a short while when it came to their competitive lineups, eventually Alex Ich reached out to Edward to see if he knew of any good supports or junglers to keep a lineup together after two of their players had left. So naturally, Edward recommended himself as well as the jungler Diamond Prox, another player who he had met through a friend in solo queue. With Edward and Diamond Prox joining this lineup of players that would become known as the Moscow 5, despite never managing to get past the range of high silver to low gold, Edward now found himself on an incredibly good team, even winning IEM events over teams such as TSM and Absolute Legends in Best of 5 series, meaning that yes, a player who was literally in a silver to gold elo range was beating TSM in tournament finals, which is just crazy. As time progressed and as Edward continued playing with the Moscow 5 lineup, which would eventually become the EULCS's Gambit Gaming, he became more of a formidable player of his own, and even over a decade later, he is still involved in the league scene by being the coach of Team BDS's Academy team, which is really cool to see all these years later. But even despite being an incredibly low-ranked player compared to the rest of his competition, Edward still never found himself with the most deaths in a single game during a Tier 1 match, something that unfortunately cannot be said about TBQ's Jarvan during the final week of the LPL spring season in 2015. You see, during the second game of this best of 2 matchup against their standing rivals of IG, LGD was looking to walk away with at least a draw to round out their regular season, opting for an incredibly dive-heavy composition with a top side of Hecarim, Jarvan, and Talon to hunt for kills. And while you would imagine that most of the team's engages would come off the back of Pyle's Blitzcrank hooks, TPQ had other plans, showing no hesitation to just jump in as Jarvan and offer his life for a kill regardless of how worth it actually was. By jumping into battle whenever he got the chance, in classic LPL fashion, the game pretty much just evolved into teamfight chaos, with a total of 60 kills by 30 minutes, with TBQ already contributing to 10 of those deaths. But in fairness, LGD had already built themselves a solid gold lead and looked poised to close out the game. Well, that is until IG managed to find a pair of picks in their base from a Talon overextend to claw themselves back to a nearly even game state as both teams began to have their full builds completed. Once again finding themselves on even footing, despite IG not having priority on Baron or the 2 smites that LGD had, they still managed to turn a post-Baron fight into their favor, securing themselves the game and awarding TBQ's aggression with a 2-14 and 11 scoreline, which even over a decade later is still the most deaths to have ever happened in a regular Tier 1 game. And as you may have expected, the LPL's classic craziness doesn't even end there, as they're also the home of the fastest Tier 1 pro game of all time. And don't worry, we'll still cover the fastest professional game of all time, even outside of the Tier 1 level, in just a moment. Fast forwarding a couple of years from TBQ's performance and into the summer of 2018, both Top Sports Gaming and RNG found themselves in the second round of the LPL playoffs, with Top coming off a 3-2 victory against Suning and RNG playing their first match of the playoffs due to their higher seeding. But despite coming off an MSI victory just a few months prior, RNG was still in need of proving that they were indeed a solid world-class lineup, with this series against Top being the perfect opportunity to do just that. Despite the series initially beginning with the teams trading victories 1 apiece, a crushing 23-minute Game 3 performance seemed to really solidify RNG's place as the series favorites. And while a 23-minute game is already incredibly quick by professional standards, by Game 4 Top just seemed like a shell of their former selves, as they were handed the fastest loss in Tier 1 play's history. Thanks to Top drafting a scaling composition, in addition to RNG getting probably one of the highest value Rift Heralds that League has ever seen, the reigning MSI champions eliminated Top from the LPL playoffs in a Game 4 that lasted a total of only 15 minutes and 34 seconds, eventually allowing RNG to make an impressive run to secure themselves their second LPL title of the year. But if we want to throw away all rules and professionality to the side for a moment, let's take a look at what the actual fastest time is for a professional team to go from a game start into breaking their opponent's nexus in an official match, with this game taking place between Top Hard Esports and another troll team during the LTL in 2019. Now, despite their ironically fitting name, another troll team was in fact a legitimate roster that fully intended on playing just standard League of Legends in what was essentially a Challengers League for the LLA during February of 2019. That is, until things began to go a little bit awry. After the draft between these two teams had concluded, there was an approximately 20-minute long analyst desk break due to connectivity issues coming from another troll team's ADC. And after determining that these problems were taking too long to resolve, another troll team were forced to play the game out as a 4v5. And knowing that they had no realistic way of winning the game, they opted to pull out strategies such as flanking Nami and base defense Lucian, as Top Hard continued to tear through their bottom lane until their ultimate cracking of the Nexus in a blazingly fast 7.5 minutes. But like I mentioned earlier, despite Cloud9 having already been featured a couple of times throughout the course of this video, unfortunately for this legendary North American organization, not only do they hold the record for the largest single player fine, but also the largest fine period, this time not coming as a result of in-game toxicity, but rather some shady contract changes. You see, in late 2017, Riot had made a rule that any active players for a professional league roster were not allowed to have any equity in the team itself, which in early 2018, Cloud9 chose to just not follow, either giving some of their players lower contracts that had equity built into them, or even by gifting equity to the team to certain players as well. And no, neither the contract amendments nor giftings were communicated to Riot at all. While it wasn't specified which players received which type of equity, these are the 7 players who all held some level of stake in the team from 2018 to 2019, with Riot fining Cloud9 $25,000 per player due to their under-the-table dealings, for a total of $175,000 in fines, and even then, things didn't stop there. On top of paying these fines to Riot, Cloud9 was also to pay out their players for any of the equity they had now lost, which in some cases would require better contract negotiations that would raise this total of payment from $175,000 to around $600,000 or so of expenses once all was said and done, which I can assure you is a record cost that no one would ever want. As always, I super appreciate you taking the time to check out this video, and if you enjoyed, feel free to like or subscribe or however you want to show your appreciation. That would be awesome. But yeah, with that all being said, hope you guys have a great rest of your day or night, and as always, I'll catch you guys in the next video. Later!